Here is a great example of a lot of the stats that you've seen so far in this module. I'm on the website fantasypros.com, and this is a fantasy football website, and you really don't have to know anything about fantasy football or fantasy sports to understand this video, but you should know that in fantasy sports, and in fantasy football in particular, players are ranked or rated all the time. And on this particular website, 38 different experts on fantasy football ranked all of the players that you're looking at. And we don't see the rankings for all 38 of those experts, but they summarized the data. They summarized the rankings for each player. For instance, if you look at the very first player here, Christian McCaffrey, you can see that out of the 38 rankings, his best ranking was 1, his worst ranking was 5, and his average ranking was 1.1, and the standard deviation of all of the rankings was 0.5. So that's a very small standard deviation. As you can see here, this is a very small range, and this is speaking to the fact that there is not much variation in the data. There is a lot of consensus that Christian McCaffrey is going to be one of the top players in fantasy football for the upcoming season. And then you can compare some of the statistics that you see with Christian McCaffrey and some of these other top tier players with other players down here. For instance, if you go down to this player, Joe Mixon, and you observe some of his stats, you could see that some of the data, some of the rankings were lower, and you can see that the lowest was 5 and that the highest was 31, and the average of all of those rankings was 11.7, and the standard deviation of those rankings was pretty high. And this high standard deviation is indicating that you have a much greater spread in the data, or a much greater spread in how Joe Mixon is being rated by the experts than you do with some of those players in that top tier. And so if you are somebody who is putting a team together in fantasy football or some other fantasy sport, and you see a player that has rankings with a high standard deviation, then that high standard deviation suggests that there's a lot of variability in where people think that that player will end up in terms of his or her performance. And when there's a lot of variability in terms of where that player ends up, then maybe that's a little bit of a riskier pick for somebody who is putting that team together. And so I just thought that this was an interesting application of range, of mean, and of standard deviation. And I would encourage you, if you come across these types of things while you're in this class, share them with your instructor, and hopefully your instructor would share them with the rest of the class, because I think that we all stand to benefit when we see the direct application of the material that we're covering in the classroom. Thanks for checking this out.